What's up? Ghost Fictions is here, and we're back again. This is the part 1 of a story where Izuku became a villain with the powers of Phoenix. Evil? What is that? Who gives more shape to history? The good, who adhere to the tried and true? Or those who seek to rouse beings out of their conformity and lead them to glory? To wash away the old and complacent and to cleanse this world of dead weight. Those words resonated inside Izuku's head. All for one was right. If he wanted to bring the change he so desired to the society, he could not bound himself by the laws of the system. He would have to rise up and shake the society from its foundations, and when the pieces all come crashing down, he will pick them up one by one, and from the mess that it once was. He will rebuild the world into something truly beautiful, or so was the plan. But before we start, please consider subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Don't forget to check the description for more informations. Now, let's get into part 1. Tokyo was burning. The sound of bullets and shells being fired flooded the city, as it had been turned into a battlefield during the last few days. Thousands have died since the fight began, and millions have perished since the start of the war. Beings die in war, such is the sacrifice that must be paid. But in the end, you will realize you have nothing left to sacrifice. And thus, the resulting void will be filled with pain. The sound of footsteps could be barely heard amongst the horrible sounds of the warfare all around. In one of the streets, someone in military uniform was passing by. While this person was physically looking down at the ground with his heavy green eyes, one looking more alive than the other, his mind was somewhere else, recalling the events that led to this moment. The sky was black, not even the stars could be seen, as smoke covered the entire city. The flames of Tokyo gave the sky a little light, making it seem as if the heavens themselves were burning. He heard the sound of steps coming from his opposite direction, and so he raised his head, and there he came face to face with her. His whole body began to shake, he could feel his heart beating violently in his chest. He was afraid. Afraid of what he knew he had to do. It was what he had been preparing to do for the last few months. The scenario that had replayed in his head for countless times was finally happening. And he couldn't be more scared. On the other side, the wind blew against the girl, causing her long blonde hair to move with the breeze. Their pair of green eyes met each other, both of which had lost their light long ago. The sound of thunder now could be heard at a distance. The sky was beginning to get covered with clouds, and it soon a few droplets started falling, and shortly after, more and more droplets fell down, until a massive thunderstorm was now whipping the city. None of them stopped looking at each other, but not a single word was said, as they could do little to change their situation. The boy drew the sword he was carrying out of its case and lifted it, pointing it towards the girl in front of him. He then slowly grabbed his sword with both of his hands, and then he moved his hands back, slowly moving his arms and positioning the blade at the back of his head. He was ready to assault. He knows that in the end, his shadow is all he will have left. He continually struggles against the shadow, but in the end, he embraces it, as the shadow understood him, the shadow forgave him, the shadow gathered him onto itself. The shadow is what he needs, as, within his furnace heart, he burns with his own flame. That is how it feels to be Izuku Midoriya, forever. These feelings are not exclusive to him, though, as, on the other side, Izumi Yagi feels fear, pain, but the chill of death cannot cool her passion, as heroes burn eternal. She raised her hands, taking a guard position. Her hands were shaking, and on from her eyes, rivers started to form, which got lost among the cries of the heavens. They have crossed the point of no return. Now it is time to end the battle that has been fought forever, and for them to burn together. And when the ash settles, humanity will go silent, as that is how the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. From the remnants of the old world, a new one will rise, which will try to amend the mistakes of the past. The question remains, though, under who will they rebuild? Under one of them? Both? Or none? Now, you must remember, behind every story is a lie. Behind every lie is a truth. Behind every truth, there is a story. For some, the story could not be farther from the truth. For others, lies are facts. For a misleading word of someone they look up to is nothing but true to them. Those stories do not have happy endings or horrific endings with a moral. Those stories are up to you to understand. Those stories are about lives lost, loyalty leading to death, and that loyalty being broken by those who earned it whilst the world was burning. There are no heroes. There are no villains. Only truths. Only thoughts. And only doubts, which lead to the good being evil, or the god being a demon, or the angel with the black wings being a prophet. In the end, though, it is all a matter of perspective, of which point of view you want to see it from. Tell me, have you ever heard the tragedy of mind versus might? I thought not. It's not a story many will tell you. It's an old legend after all. Some believe it is based on a true story, others believe it to be just myths from a long forgotten era. In the end, the choice of what it means to you is yours to decide. If you are ready, then, let the story begin. Of all the liars in the world, sometimes the worst are our own fears. Rudyard Kipling. Brother, The voice of a little girl could be heard. Brother. Brother. Wake up. Please wake up. The voice of the girl grew much desperate with each passing second. This little girl was Izumi Yagi, who was 3 years old at the time. Izumi was desperately shaking her half-brother, Izuku Midoriya, lying unconscious on the ground, below a tree, in the garden of their house. Brother. It's not funny. Please wake up. Izumi said as tears were running down her cheeks and landing on Izuku's face. Izuku slowly opened up his, and he growled in pain as he moved his hand to his head, rubbing it. Brother. Izumi exclaimed as she widened her eyes in surprise and immediately picked her brother between her arms, giving him a warm hug while burying her face in his shoulder. You dumb. Don't do that. I was scared. Izumi said as she hugged her brother tightly. Izuku blinked a few times, recalling the events that had just happened. Izuku and Izumi played on the garden with their hero toys when they suddenly saw a small white cat climb up the tree. In cliché style, the baby cat got stuck in one of the branches high on the tree. Izuku immediately knew what he had to do, and he stood up from the place he was playing with Izumi and walked to the tree. He eyed it from top to bottom, and he started climbing it. Wait. Brother. As she stood up and ran to the tree, Izumi said she looked up to Izuku who was still climbing the tree. It's dangerous. You could get hurt. Izumi half shouted at Izuku, but she did not shout too much so their parents wouldn't see what Izuku was doing, as she was sure they would reprimand him. I know. Izuku also half shouted back to Izumi. But heroes must always be willing to risk themselves to help others, especially if they are cute animals. Izuku looked back up at the baby cat and continued to climb up the tree. I know, but at least let me help. Izumi continued arguing with her brother. She was growing worried as she saw her brother climb up the tree up. Izuku sighed and looked back down at Izumi. Don't worry, it's easy, I just need to follow the patterns of the branches, see? Izuku said as he pointed at all the branches as if it was evident that there was a path to follow. Just stay down there and be ready to catch the cat when I throw it. Izuku replied and then continued to climb, a look of determination on his face. Izumi sighed, she knew there was no use in trying to argue with her brother anymore. Alright. Izumi positioned herself right below where the cat was and looked up to see Izuku once again. Just be careful. It didn't take much longer for Izuku to reach the branch where the cat was. Izuku started to climb on the branch to try and catch the little cat, which hissed at Izuku when he attempted to grab it. Don't worry, little guy. It will all be fine. You know why? Because I am here. Izuku said, imitating his favorite hero. The cat lowered its guard as it relaxed, looks like Izuku can have that effect. Izuku extended his hand once again and grabbed the cat. Got you. Izuku said with a smile. Izuku looked down at where Izumi was. Catch. Izuku said as he let the cat fall to Izumi. It screamed as it fell, but it was the caught in between the little arms of Izumi. Don't worry. You are safe. Izumi said as she smiled down at the baby cat. Izumi then placed the cat down on the floor, allowing it to run away. Be free, little guy. Izumi then turned to Izuku, who was still on the branch where the cat was. Now get down. Izumi ordered. Right, Izuku said as he started to climb down. As Izuku moved down through the branches, he was not looking where he was setting his feet, and so at one point, Izuku misplaced one foot and he almost fell. In his surprise, Izuku gripped to one of the branches too hard, causing it to break. Izuku fell all the way and landed on the ground. Izuku. Izumi's scream was the last thing he heard before it all turned black. Back at present, Izuku blinked a few times once again before awkwardly laughing while rubbing the back of his head. I'm sorry for worrying you. Izuku said as Izumi stopped hugging him and sat back. I won't do it again, I promise. Izuku continued as he kept rubbing his head. Kids. Are you alright? Izuku and Izumi turned around to look at Inko, who had peeked out the house to look at her two children. Inko was the common parent for Izuku and Izumi, their fathers were different. Izuku's father left even before Izuku was born. Shortly after, Inko met All Might, or Toshinori Yagi, her current husband and Izumi's father. There are only a few months of difference between Izuku and Izumi. Izuku and Izumi looked back at each other before grinning sheepishly, and they started snickering, causing Inko to raise an eyebrow at them. We were just playing, Mom. Izumi exclaimed as she turned back to Inko. That's all. Izumi said as she closed her eyes as she smiled innocently at her mother. Inko raised an eyebrow once again, not entirely convinced. Is that true? Inko asked as she turned to look at Izuku. Izuku thought for a few seconds before answering. Yes. It's true. We were playing. Nothing more. What else would we be doing? Izuku asked as he tilted his head to appear innocent. Inko looked back and forth between Izuku and Izumi, causing both of them to start sweating, but their smiles never left their faces. Finally, Inko sighed. Very well, just be careful, understood. Inko said as she crossed her arms. Yes. The two siblings said in sync. A small smile formed on Inko's face. Very well, then have fun. Inko then walked back into the house. The two children looked back at each other before releasing the breath that they had been unknowingly holding. That was close, Izumi commented before looking at her brother. Izumi was taken aback as she saw that Izuku was looking at her with his eyes narrowed. What? Izumi asked as she tilted her head. Why did you lie to mom? Izuku asked as he continued to look at Izumi with narrowed eyes. Well, we both did, didn't we? Izumi asked as she chuckled. I know, Izuku said as he stopped narrowing his eyes. But you lied to her first, and for no reason too, you wouldn't have been punished anyways. They say heroes shouldn't lie. Izumi blinked a few times before laughing sheepishly, and then she lightly smacked Izuku in the head. Hey. Izuku said. What was that for? You dumb. Izumi exclaimed. Lying is not something a hero does, but I will do it if it means helping you. Because you are my brother first. Izumi finished as she smiled at Izuku. Izuku blinked a few times as he looked at Izumi before smiling too. Thanks. You are the best sister I could ask for. Izumi then hugged Izuku. And you are the bestest brother I could ask for. Izumi then leaned back and smiled at Izuku. So please, next time, let me help you, okay? Yeah, okay, Izuku said as he finished with a small chuckle. Remember, we are in this together, okay? Izumi smiled as she raised her hand toward Izuku while raising her pinky. Izuku looked at Izumi's hand before doing the same, interlocking their pinkies. Yeah, together, Izuku said as he smiled. Together forever? Izumi asked, the smile not leaving her face. Yeah, together forever. A few months later. Izuku and Izumi were walking side by side through the track of forest. They were almost crying of laughter as they were with their best friends, Kitsuki Bakugo, Shoto Todoroki and Shako Todoroki. The latter were the Todoroki twins boy, Shoto, and the other female, Shako. While Bakugo was the son of a childhood friend of Inko, the Todorokis were friends from the same kindergarten, and they were the children of the number 2 hero, Endeavor. The kids walked through the path as they continued to joke. Bakugo had a basketball on his hand which he bounced as they walked. In between their laughter, Izuku managed to pick up a sound coming from one of the trees. He turned around and looked up. Izumi, who was next to him, noticed her brother suddenly stopping and she turned around. She glanced at her brother and then she looked up as well. Shako, Shoto and Bakugo continued to walk. Isn't that right, Izuku? Bakugo asked as he smirked. He turned around to see Izuku and Izumi looking up at a tree when he heard no answer. Bakugo blinked as he stopped bouncing the basketball. Shako and Shoto turned around, and when they saw Izuku and Izumi, they looked at each other. Shoto shrugged, and the three of them walked towards the half-siblings. What are we looking at? Shako asked innocently. When Shako looked up to the tree, she realized that a baby cat seemed to be trapped at the top of it. Oh no. Shako said as she looked with watery eyes at the cat. And it just come down on its own. Bakugo said as he scoffed. Of course not, idiot, Shoto replied. It's still just a baby. Izuku and Izumi turned to look at each other, and when their eyes met, they smirked. Without saying a word, Izumi ran to the tree's base and placed her hands together, extending it in front of her, creating a platform. Izuku ran and toward Izumi and then jumped, landing on top of Izumi's hand, and then with the help of Izumi, Izuku managed to jump high enough to land directly on the branch. Izuku, with a smile, grabbed the cat and then dropped it to the ground, where Izumi caught it and then placed it back on the ground. Izumi looked up at Izuku and nodded at him, with Izuku nodding back. Izuku then let himself fall, while Izumi extended her hands. Bakugo, Shoto and Shako realized what they were doing, and they ran toward them, helping Izumi catch Izuku. "Got they all said in unison. They then helped Izuku back to his feet. Wow. Shako said, amazed at the stun the two half-siblings had just pulled. Where did you learn that? We have been practicing it for a while, Izuku said as he rubbed the back of his head. Yeah, ever since this dum-dum fell from a tree trying to help a cat and almost died. Izumi exclaimed as she playfully smacked Izuku on the back of his head. Traitor. Izuku pouted. I thought we were not going to tell anyone. What? Shako shouted, causing Izuku and Izumi to look back at her. You almost died, Shako exclaimed as tears were trying to escape her eyes. And no. Izuku replied. Izumi is just exaggerating, it was nothing. Don't worry. Izuku said as he frantically waved his hands around, and then he shot a glare toward Izumi. They knew Shako could be quite sensitive, so why did she had to joke about that? TSK, I could probably do it better. Bakugo exclaimed. I'm sure Kaken, Izuku said as he laughed nervously. He knew better than to argue with him, as he quickly learned that arguing with him would lead nowhere. It is as they say, no matter how good you are at chess, if you play against a pigeon, it will eventually just shit on the board and then think that it won. Should we ask Dad to help us train with something like that? Shoto asked her sister. Wiping her tears, Shako turned to her brother. Dad said that he would only train us once we get our quirks, although he said that it depends. Depends on what? Izuku asked as he tilted his head. I don't know, Shako said as she shrugged. I only heard him mutter that last part, so I didn't hear all of it. We will all eventually be trained, Izumi said. And we will all go to UA in the future. We will be unstoppable. Of course. Bakugo exclaimed. We will kick the villains' asses. Yeah. Shoto exclaimed too. As Bakugo and Shoto kept talking with each other about how they would kick the ass of the first villain they fight, Izuku and Izumi turned to look at each other and then at Shako before laughing. When their laughter died down, Izuku extended his hand, placing it in between. Together forever? Izuku asked. The two girls looked at him before smiling and placing their hands on top of his. Together forever. They both replied. A few weeks later. Izuku and Izumi were on their garden again, running around and laughing while playing heroes and villains. Toshinori, in his deflated form, walked toward the garden and called his children. Kids. We have people visiting. Come say hi. Toshinori exclaimed before walking back to the house. Izuku and Izumi looked at each other and they shrugged before running toward the house. Once inside, they saw two people they have never seen. One was a man with light brown hair, a beard and glasses who was wearing casual clothes. The other was a little girl who was tugging to the pants of the man. She had blonde hair, blue eyes and was wearing a pink dress. Kids, this is David Shield, Toshinori said as he stood next to him. He is an old friend of mine. Hello, you must be Izuku and Izumi, right? David said as he kneeled in front of them. Yes sir. Izuku replied with a smile. Hi. Izumi said while smiling too. David smiled at them and then he stepped to the side and pushed the little girl toward them. This is my daughter, Melissa, David said, and then he looked down at Melissa. Say hi to them. Hi, Melissa said in a shy tone. Izuku and Izumi looked at each other before grinning. After all, they were the doom of shy kids. Each of them grabbing one of the hands of Melissa, they started to drag her toward the garden, much to the girl's panic. Come on. Izuku said. Let's go play heroes and villains. Izumi continued. The two adults weren't sure if they should laugh or help Melissa as the two siblings were basically kidnapping her. They both turned to look at each other with an amused smile. Sorry, Toshinori said. They can be quite the handful sometimes. I realize that, David said with a chuckle. Don't worry, though, I'm happy. Ever since we moved to Island, it has been hard for Melissa to adapt, and there aren't really any kids for her to play with, so it's nice to see them take her under their wing. In the garden. Do you like heroes, Melissa? Izuku asked as he released her and turned back to her. Oh, of course. Melissa replied, still a hint of shyness on her voice. Don't be shy, Izumi said. We are all friends here. Come on, let's play, shall we? Izuku exclaimed impatiently. Melissa couldn't help the smile that formed on her face. It had been a while since they had moved to Island, and thus it had been a while since she had played with anyone. So, Melissa was glad to be able to finally act like a child again. Right. Melissa exclaimed, this time more cheerful than before, which caused the two siblings to smile at her. After a few hours of playing, the three children now laid on the ground, with dirt and sweat covering their clothes and faces. Even though they were utterly exhausted, they couldn't help but continue laughing. It had been a while since I had this much fun, Melissa said as she looked at the sky. The two siblings turned to look at each other and smiled. Of course, fun is our middle name. Izuku exclaimed with a chuckle. Say, Melissa, do you want to be a hero when you grow big? Izumi asked as she sat and looked at Melissa. Of course. I want to help people. Just like my dad does with his inventions. Melissa exclaimed as she sat up. In that case, it's decided, Izuku said as he sat up too, causing the two girls to look at him. Once we are adults, you will be a part of our team too. Izuku exclaimed as he smiled at them. What? Melissa exclaimed, surprised by the boy's declaration. Yeah, that sounds good. Izumi exclaimed. We will be the greatest hero team out there. She said as she threw her fist in the air. So, what do you say? Izumi asked as she turned to her friend. Melissa blinked a few times before tears started to run down her cheeks, causing Izuku and Izumi to worry. Are you alright? What happened? Izuku asked as he got closer to Melissa. Sorry. I'm just happy, Melissa said as she wiped out her tears. I accept. Melissa exclaimed with a smile. We will be the best heroes out there. Izuku and Izumi blinked before smiling. Yeah. They both said, and then they placed their hands forward. In that case, together forever? Izumi asked. Melissa looked at them for a few seconds before she too placed her hand and smiled. Together forever. A few months later, shortly after Izumi's 4th birthday and some time after Izuku's 4th birthday. Izuku and Shako were at the kindergarten, they were playing in the sandbox that was there. "I finished," Izuku exclaimed. This caused Shako to raise her head from the castle model she was using to make her sandcastle. When she looked up, she saw a massive sandcastle which Izuku had built. After the shock passed, the still gaping Izumi turned to Izuku, who was standing next to the castle which was almost as big as him. "How did you do that?" Shako shouted, to which Izuku just laughed. "It was all in here," Izuku said as he pointed toward his head. Shako then looked down at her model and lifted it, revealing a small sandcastle, which promptly fell apart, causing Shako to fall into a sad state. Izuku approached her, placed a hand on her shoulder, and then grabbed her hand, causing Shako, who had a few tears in her eyes, to look at him. "Hey, don't be sad. It's all a matter of practice. So, what do you say if we build one together, that way you can start learning?" Izuku said as he smiled at Shako, whose eyes shone as she looked at Izuku. "Right." Shako replied as she smiled back. "Izuku." Izuku and Shako turned around to see Izumi with her and Izuku's bags, waving at him. "Mom's here for us." Izuku and Shako looked back at each other. "I guess it will have to be another time," Izuku said as he released her hold on Shako's hand and stood up. "And you stay for a few more minutes?" Shako asked as she looked up to Izuku, to which he shook his head. "We are going to the doctor, they are going to check Izumi and me to see what our quirks are," Izuku exclaimed excitedly. "Oh, I see, my daddy is going to take us, my brother and me, to the doctor to see our quirks too," Shako exclaimed. "That's cool," Izuku exclaimed. "We will tell each other about that later, okay?" "Of course," Shako exclaimed. Izuku then waved at Shako. "See you later," Izuku said. "You too," Shako replied, they both had smiled on their faces. Izuku then ran towards his sister, who threw him his bag, which Izuku caught. "Bye Shako," Izumi yelled as she waved her hands. "Bye." At the doctor's office, a few hours later. The doctor looked up from his paper to stare at Inko, who had Izumi sitting on one side and Izuku on the other side. "So, what are the news, doctor?" Inko said. She had an odd feeling in her, as she felt that something was about to go wrong. "Well, I guess I must first congratulate you, as your little girl right here has a quirk that is quite powerful," the doctor stated in a monotone voice. Inko was relieved when she heard that, but still, the odd feeling just wouldn't go away. Izuku turned to look at Izumi, and when Izumi turned to him, Izuku smiled and gave her a thumbs up. Her quirk is a form of electrokinesis which allows her to manipulate electricity and other forms of energy at her will. To which extent her powers go is still unknown, though, the doctor said as he pushed up his weird-looking glasses. "Now, for your boy." Izuku stiffened, he felt that whatever the doctor was going to say, he was not going to like it. "I'm sorry to say this, but he is quirkless." There was a moment of silence. Izumi turned with sad eyes to look at her brother. She saw him in a state of utter shock. Izuku's mouth was open, and his eyes were as big as plates, while his whole body was tensed. "That is all from my part," the doctor said. "You may leave now." Inko and her children walked out of the doctor's office. Izuku was still in a state of shock, of which he was brought out when he felt a hand on his shoulder. "It doesn't matter that you don't have a quirk," Izumi said, causing Izuku to look at her. "I know you can still be a hero. I know you too, and I know you won't give up. We made a promise, remember? We will be the greatest heroes out there when we grow up, quirk or not, or were you planning to break the promise?" Izuku looked at Izumi for a few seconds before smiling at her. "Never." "In that case." Izumi extended her hand toward him, her pinky up. Izuku extended his hand too, and their pinkies interlinked. "Together forever," they both said before smiling. Inko looked down at her children with a fond smile. She was worried about Izuku and his mental state, but she knew there was probably nothing to worry about after seeing the two interact. At the Todoroki household. Baltuia, Fujumi and Natsuo were playing around in the house. Enji pulled Shoto and Shako by the arm toward the training room. "But Dad. We want to play," Shoto exclaimed. "Silence," Endeavor said in a harsh tone, causing Shoto and Shako to give their father a scared look. "We have no time to waste now." A grin spread through Endeavor's face. "What did I do to get so lucky with these twins? 2 for the price of 1. Endeavor thought excitedly. "All Might, if I can't get your title, then I will make sure they can." 1 year later. Ever since that fateful day, everything changed. The next day of school, Izuku revealed to his group of friends that he was quirkless. The Todorokis acted with indifference, not really caring about him having a quirk or not. Izuku noticed something off that day with him. Izuku saw that both Shoto and Shako had bruises and bandages in different parts of their bodies. Izuku, concerned, asked them about what had happened, but both simply waved it off and said that they had been playing and things got a bit extreme. Izuku couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at that explanation. From that point forwards, the Todoricus became distant, not really talking, the light in their eyes fading day by day. Izuku and Izumi noticed these changes, and as friends, they grew worried for them, but whenever they tried to approach them, the Todoricus always tried to put more distance between themselves and them. Meanwhile, another person who had a complete change of attitude was Bakugo. When the news of Izuku being quirkless was told, Bakugo immediately started to tease Izuku about it, and soon the teases became insults, and the abuses became flat-out bullying. Izuku endured it, he was strong, something like that was not going to make him fall. Useless. Idiot. Stupid. You will never amount to anything. You will never be a hero. Those were just some of the insults that Izuku had to endure day by day. Thankfully, he always had his sister by his side, supporting him, as any sibling would. One day, Izuku and the rest of his class boys were playing a game of football. Izuku was running with the ball, he had managed to pass the other team's defense, and was on his way to score a goal, but suddenly, he felt as someone pushed him, making him fall. His face hit the ground, and when he looked up, he saw Shoto with the ball, which he then kicked towards one of his teammates. Shoto then turned around, and their eyes locked on each other. "Sorry," Shoto said as he looked away and then went running out. Izuku stood up and didn't pursue the matter, but he managed to catch a hint of something, or instead, the lack of something, sincerity. As Shoto ran away, he tried to suppress the slightest smile that had formed on his face. Shoto shook his head, he knew those thoughts were not good, but then, why? Why did it felt so good to not be the one being punched now? Was this how it felt being in control? Shoto once again shook his head. He shouldn't think like that was not what a hero would think. But still. The feeling was there. The feeling of power, and he drowned in it. Shoto was suddenly hit in the face with the ball, causing him to fall down. When he opened his eyes, he looked up to see Bakugo looking down at him with a smirk on his face. "Look where you are going, Scarface," Bakugo said as he laughed before running away to chase after the ball. And just like that feeling of being a slave to someone else returned. A sense of uselessness invaded him, just like every time he saw his father looking down at him. But this time, he was able to keep his head out of that sea of sorrow, as one sensation drove him forwards, and the craving for power consumed him. Once the match was over, the class ended as well. Izuku and the rest of the course walked back to their classroom. Izuku was approached by Izumi, who brought him a bottle of water. While they were speaking, in between the crowd, Izuku spotted Shako walking with her head down. Izuku noticed that she had a bandage on her left eye. So she had a scar too. Izuku wondered about the possibility, but what could have caused it? It was only until now that he had noticed Shoto had a scar on his face. After all, they had been missing for a few days, maybe it had something to do with that. Izuku wanted to go to her and talk to her like they did just a mere year ago, but in the end, he chickened out. Izuku suddenly bumped into someone, causing both of them to fall down. "Boy!" He heard a rash voice yell at him. Izuku opened his eyes to see Bakugo, sitting on the ground. "What do you think you are doing, nerd?" Bakugo yelled at Izuku as he stood up. "I'm going to teach you not to get in my way," Bakugo said as sparks came out of the palms of his hand. "Quit it, Bakugo," Izumi said as she stood between Bakugo and Izuku. Izumi glared at Bakugo, which caused him to step back. "If you do anything to him, you will answer to me." "TSK," Bakugo clicked his tongue. "Whatever." Bakugo turned around and stormed away from the site. Izumi sighed and turned to her brother. "You shouldn't meddle in what happens with me," Izuku said to her. "Why? We are siblings, and have you already forgotten our promise?" Izumi said as she smiled at him. Izuku looked at her sister for a few seconds before smiling. "Of course not," Izuku replied. Izumi extended her hand toward him. "Then, let's get going," Izumi said as Izuku grabbed her hand and rose to his feet. 3 years later. Some things have changed. Now, not only Bakugo picks on Izuku, but Shoto as well, and Shoto is also frequently picked on by Bakugo too. The abuse on the Todoroki household is also going out of hand, as many times have Shoto and Shako not come to school because they had a broken bone or were just too bruised to move. The teachers found it strange, but seeing as they Todoricus were the number 2 hero's children, they decided not to pry on the matter for their own sake. Still, they repeatedly intervened whenever Bakugo tried to bother Shoto or any other quirked kid for that matter, but never when it involved Izuku. The only one who would ever step in to defend him was Izumi. One day, Toshinori and Inko called for Izuku and Izumi to join them at the living room. "You called, Dad?" Izumi asked as she walked into the living room with Izuku. "Please take a seat," Toshinori said as he signaled to the couch in front of them. Izuku and Izumi did as told and sat down on the couch. "Your father and I have something important to tell you," Inko started. Izuku and Izumi looked at each other, raising an eyebrow. "You see," Toshinori started, grabbing the attention of the kids. Toshinori suddenly inflated, transforming into All Might. Our heroes. All Might's booming voice said. Izuku and Izumi looked at him, unimpressed. Yeah, we had figured it out already, Izuku plainly stated. What? Toshinori said as he deflated. We are not stupid, Izumi told them. Yeah, we spend hours looking at heroes, and you really expect us to not have figured it out by now? Izuku asked as he raised an eyebrow. Inko and Toshinori looked at each other, and then they looked at their children with a smile. Looks like we underestimated your fanness, Inko said as she chuckled. So, does this mean you will train us now? Izumi asked as she crossed her arms. But of course. Toshinori exclaimed. What do you say we start now? Izuku and Izumi looked at each other with a grin. Yes. They both exclaimed, which caused their parents to smile at them. After this revelation, Izuku and Izumi started to be trained in the ways of being a hero. In other words, they began to teach them combat. Izuku, due to not having a quirk, asked his parents to train him in hand-to-hand combat, but they were only able to train him in the basics, as none of them had relied on it too much. This, of course, wasn't enough for Izuku, who would go on to self-train himself in martial arts the best he could. Izuku and Izumi would also often spar with each other to better hone their fighting skills. While Izuku was, of course, nowhere on the level of a properly trained martial artist, he could still easily take someone out if they had no training, or if they were distracted. This plus his sharp mind made him a threat in the ring if you lowered your guard too much. Izuku and Izumi would always train with each other, every day after school. They were both working to fulfill their promise, to become the greatest heroes out there, together. 2 years later. It was a rainy day. Through the TVS of the city, a news reporter was giving a message. It has been confirmed already that the hero titan, whose real name was Inko Midoriya, died during the early hours of the morning. She succumbed to the wound she suffered in her battle with the villain Slicer. She managed to save all the 250 people that had been taken hostage by the terrorist. We grieve her passing, and we offer our condolences to the family of the hero. Izuku and Izumi stood in the cemetery as they watched their mother's coffin being lowered down to the ground. Their eyes were red, and they both had dry tears on their cheeks. Toshinori was sitting on a chair, his already messy blonde hair even more chaotic than usual. He was looking at a picture of him and Inko the day of their wedding almost 10 years ago. After a few more minutes, he could not handle it, and his tears began to mix with the droplets of rain that fell on his face. The next day. Izuku was sitting in the stairs of the school's court. Toshinori was still at work, so there was no one to come pick him up. Izumi, on the other hand, left the school by walking to go to train. Izuku couldn't blame her, as he knew she wanted to get her mind of the recent painful event. Meanwhile, Izuku wanted to spend some time alone to process what had just happened. As he looked at the nothingness, a shadow caused him to blink, making him regain his focus. Izuku turned his head and saw Shako standing at the side of him. She was still wearing her bandage over the eye. Shako sat next to Izuku. They both looked down and spent the next few minutes in silence before Shako spoke. I heard about your mother. I'm sorry. Shako said, not really knowing how to comfort him. You don't have to apologize, it is not like you were the one that killed her. Izuku said without looking up. I know, but I still think I should apologize. Izuku turned his head to him and raised an eyebrow. I've been distant with you over the past few years. And I never really wanted that. It's just. Don't worry, Izuku interrupted her. I know you had your reasons. Still. Shako exclaimed. The promise we made that day. Shako said as tears began to form in her eye. Shako was then surprised when Izuku placed his hand on top of hers. Shako turned to look at him. Izuku stared at her for a few seconds before his hand reached out to her bandages. Izuku started to unmake them slowly and gently. Shako wanted to protest the boy's action, but she couldn't. After a few seconds, Izuku managed to undo all the bandages, revealing the scar that adorned Shako's left side of her face. Izuku noticed that she too had tears in that eye, just as he suspected. Shako looked down. She was embarrassed that Izuku had to see the scar in her face. She almost started to hyperventilate as she began to worry over what Izuku may think. To Shako's surprise, though, Izuku extended his hand and began to clear the tears on her face. Aren't you the one that is in pain? Shako asked Izuku as he kept cleaning her face. I know you are too, Izuku stated. I have always noticed it, but I knew you weren't ready to speak about it. Having a sharp mind can lead to people realize certain things, which can either be a blessing or a curse. Your mother just passed. Shako said as she looked down. You shouldn't be worrying about me. What kind of hero would I be if I put myself before others? Izuku asked. Helping those who are in need, even when you are pain. That is how my mother died. She stood for her beliefs. I will not dishonor her death by being selfish and think that I need to receive pity. You idiot. Shako said before hugging Izuku. You should think about yourself too, you know. Izuku didn't reply and just hugged her back. After a minute, Izuku separated from Shako's arm and looked at her. "It is still not too late to act on your promise," Izuku stated. Shako blinked and then smiled at him. "Right," she said as she cleaned her last tears. "Together forever. Together forever." At the Yagi household, a few hours later. Izumi and Toshinori were sitting across each other in the training room. "Izumi," Toshinori said, gaining back the attention of the girl. "Did you get it all?" Izumi blinked for a few seconds before nodding her head. "Why yeah, I think so. Your quirk is one for all, which has been passed down from generation to generation, so it can serve for the good of everyone, right?" "Pretty much," Toshinori said. "So, why are you telling me this?" Izumi asked as she raised an eyebrow. "Because I want you to have it," Toshinori stated. "What?" Izumi asked as she tilted her head. "Your body has been trained for several years now, I'm sure you will be able to handle a small portion of it by now, and your control over it will continue to grow with time." "Wait, but why?" Izumi asked. "Why now?" Toshinori bit his lip. "As you can see, the hero job is a very dangerous one. Where it is possible that one day you will have to make the ultimate sacrifice, just like your mother did." Toshinori started. "As you can see, I'm injured, so it will only be a matter of time before a villain gets me, so I want to make sure one for all leaves on. Also, seeing as you will take the life of a hero too, I want you to have as much power as you can so you are protected." "Wait," Izumi said. "But, why not give it to Izuku? He is quirkless, and he wants to be a hero too, so." "No." Toshinori interrupted his daughter. I can't send him to do something as dangerous like that. I love Izuku. But he was Inko's son. He is all there is left of her. The closest thing there is to her. I cannot lose him too. That is why he will not receive the quirk, so he can stay safe and do something else with his life, while you, who will take the mantle of hero, will be fully protected," Toshinori said. "Izuku still wants to be a hero, we promised that." Izumi was interrupted. "I said no," Toshinori shouted. "That is just a childish promise," Toshinori started. "There are villains that just can't be defeated without a quirk. Quirkless people have no place being in there. It is too dangerous. What happened to your mother? I don't want to see that again." "But with one for all, he could." "No, as no. And period," Toshinori yelled. "I will not be discussing this matter anymore." "In that case, I don't want your stupid one for all," Izumi said as she stood up and stormed out of the room. Still, after that conversation, the first seeds of doubt were planted in Izumi's soul. After a few months, Izuku was finally feeling well enough to restart his training. When the afternoon came, he went searching for Izumi, who she found in the training room. "Hey, sis," Izuku exclaimed as he entered. "Let's spar." "Oh, Izuku," Izumi said awkwardly. "Oh well, you know, what if we don't spar today?" "What?" Izuku asked as he tilted his head. "Oh well, it's just." Izumi rubbed the back of her head. "I'm not feeling too well. So let's save this for another day, okay?" Sure," Izuku replied. "Get better soon, will you?" Izuku said as he turned around and waved his hand. "Right." The next day, Izuku tried to spar with Izumi again to get the same excuse, then he tried the next day, then the next, then the next. For a week, this went on with the last days Izumi giving Izuku whatever excuse she could come up with. Finally, after 7 days, Izuku had enough. "Okay, will you at least tell me what the real reason for you not wanting to spar?" Izuku as he rubbed his nose. What do you mean?" Izumi asked nervously. "Sis, you know I'm not stupid," Izuku stated as he stared at his sister. Izumi sighed. "I just don't want to hurt you." "What?" Izuku asked as he raised his eyebrow. "I mean, what if my quirk suddenly gets out of control and I blast you by accident, or I apply too much force and I break a bone in your body? If that happened, I would never forgive myself," Izumi said as she looked down. "Sis, I know you have enough control to not let that happen," Izuku pointed out. "But, you know I can be clumsy, so, what if it does happen?" "Then what?" Izumi asked. "Well," was the only thing Izuku said as he tried to think of an answer. "Sorry, Izuku, I just can't do it," Izumi said softly as she turned around and walked out of the room. Izuku was left saddened that Izumi no longer wanted to spar with him. Still, in the end, he could understand her, as he would also feel incredibly guilty if he were to accidentally injure his sister mortally. Yet, though, the first damage was already done. A year later, Izuku and Izumi walked down a path in the middle of a park, the same park they used to come to play when they still talked to their friends. Now, it was only them and Shako who had started to reintegrate with them. Bakugo kept his bullying streak against Shoto, who had become a bigger target for him over the years, which prompted Shoto to keep up his harassment against Izuku. Until they stopped and apologized, Izumi would never consider them friends anymore. As they walked, they heard a meow coming up from one of the trees. They stopped and looked up to see a cat on one of the branches of the tree. Memories flooded them both at the moment, and a small smile formed on their faces. Still, before Izuku could say anything, Izumi quickly ran toward the tree and jumped all the way to the branch. She grabbed the cat in her arms and then jumped back to the ground, laying the cat down when she did. When Izumi looked back to Izuku after putting the cat down, she saw him frowning at her. "I could have helped, you know," Izuku said in an irate tone. "Well," Izumi said as she looked down. "What if you fell and hit your head again like that time?" Izumi pointed out. "It could be dangerous." Izuku raised an eyebrow when he heard the answer. "That was when we were 3, I know better now," Izuku stated. "Still, the risk is there," Izumi said. "And if you can avoid it, it would be for the best." Izuku frowned once again, but he didn't pursue the matter anymore. Ever since their mother passed, Izumi started to act differently, but Izuku couldn't exactly understand why. A year later, in school, Izuku was punched back against a locker. He had blood trailing down from his mouth. Izuku quickly regained his composure, cleaning off the blood and taking his guard up. He looked up to see a band of 3 boys famous in their school for being gangsters. "You want more?" the leader of the group said in a challenging tone. Izuku simply narrowed his eyes, ready to continue the fight. Suddenly, a beam of light passed by his side, and it hit the 3 boys in front of him. The gang was shot back, and they then all laid unconscious on the floor. Izuku turned around to look at Izumi with her hand extended. "I could have taken care of them myself, you know," Izuku asked. He had a scowl on his face. "You don't need to fight," Izumi said with a sigh. "That's why I'm here to keep you safe. Next time, please just call me instead of getting involved in another fight, will you?" Izumi turned around and started to walk away. Izuku, meanwhile, looked at her retreating back, his eyebrows furrowed and his hands clenching into fists. He could defend himself. He knew Izumi was just looking out for him, but he wasn't just a defenseless kid. Still, no matter what he did, Izumi didn't see it that way. To her, she had to protect Izuku from all dangers, but that isn't what he wanted. "Just because I don't have a quirk doesn't mean I'm weak," Izuku muttered under his breath. Once again, though, he didn't pursue the matter. He just turned around and walked toward his classroom. During the last year of middle school, it had been a tiring day, as they had to endure Bakugo gloating about him going into UA and becoming the #1 hero. During the day, they had given them their career assessment papers, as it was time for them to choose which high school to go after the end of the year. Izuku had mostly disconnected himself during the entire day, as he had no intentions of hearing the idiots of his class mumbling. As Izuku walked out of the school, he found Shako also getting ready for getting the hell out of there. Shako had grown into a pretty girl, Izuku admits, but that had also been a bane for her. Due to her shy nature, he was a target for his school's hormonal teens, who always gloated over her and harassed her. Meanwhile, the girls would always do their best to lower her self-esteem, out of the envy they felt due to the attention she was given. Thankfully, he and Izumi were there to get her out of trouble, since Shoto didn't seem to particularly care about what happened to Shako. Izuku and Izumi were the only friends she had, and she appreciated them very dearly. Izuku approached Shako, playfully poking her in the side of her stomach. Over the years, and thanks to his self-training, Izuku had become much better at stealth and fighting. Still, his technique needed polishing. Shako squeaked and turned to him, a slight blush and a frown in her face. "Idiot, don't do that." Shako then playfully punched him in the chest. Izuku felt a sharp pain in his chest. Shako was quite strong, well, she was trained by Endeavor after all. Izuku hid the pain though, as he knew that Shako would just feel bad for injuring him. "See you tomorrow," Izuku said with a bright smile. Shako stopped frowning and smiled at him before hugging him. "Right, see you tomorrow," Izuku corresponded to hug, and after a few seconds, they broke off. Izuku walked toward his sister, who was waiting for him in the doors of the school. Shako meanwhile, watched the retreating form of Izuku. A sense of loneliness engulfed her once again. Shako wished to stay with Izuku and Izumi. Well, mostly Izuku if she was honest, not that Izumi was a terrible company, she was her best friend, but there was something else about Izuku that just made her want to hug him and not let go. After all, he made her forget about everything when they were together, but now, it was time for her to return to there. When Izuku saw Izumi, he saw her with a giant grin in her face and teasing eyes. Izuku just rolled his eyes in response. They began to walk back to their home, but Izuku noticed something odd about Izumi. She was reticent. Izuku didn't understand why she wasn't talking, maybe something in her mind. After a few minutes of walking in silence, Izumi finally spoke up. "Brother, what career are you planning to follow?" Izumi asked while they kept walking. "The hero path," Izuku said simply, "wasn't it obvious?" Izumi visibly twitched and she stopped walking. Izuku noticed this and stopped walking too, and then he turned around to look at his sister. "Something wrong?" Izuku asked as he raised an eyebrow. "Well, I was just wondering, don't you think you could follow another career path?" Izumi asked. "What?" "I mean, you're smart, I'm sure you could easily get a job as scientist, and hey, you could even help to save people's lives with your inventions," Izumi exclaimed cheerfully. Izuku eyed her for a few seconds. "Have you forgotten our promise?" Izumi bit her lip. "It was just a childish promise we made when we were little," Izumi replied. "A childish promise?" Izuku asked. "That is all it was to you?" Izuku said as he clenched his fists. "Izuku, it's just. I don't think you should become a hero," Izumi said as she looked down. Izuku's eyes widened. Did he just heard her correctly? "Excuse me?" Izuku asked, still shocked. "Izuku, it's dangerous," Izumi said as she looked up. She had a few tears that had started to form on her eyes. "Look what happened to mom. If you don't have a quirk, what would happen to you?" "So is that what you really think?" Izuku growled at Izumi. "That I am just some weak, defenseless child? There are some villains that just can't be defeated without a quirk," Izumi snapped back at him. "Even with a quirk, it's still hazardous. I will not allow you to go and fight villains if it can be avoided. That's why I'm here to protect you. To fight the battles for you. Have you ever wondered if that is what I really want? Or you have and just not care?" This was the time for Izuku to snap back at Izumi. "If I want to change the world, I can't just sit back and let other people do the job for me. And I will show you. I will show you I don't need your protection. I will show you I can bring change to this world. And I will do it without your help." Izumi clenched her fists, which were shaking right now. "Fine. But when you find something that is too much for you to chew on, don't come asking for my help. And when you die, I will not cry for you." "That's fine by me," Izuku said as he walked away from the site. "Then it's fine by me too," Izumi said as she stormed away in the opposite direction. As they walked away, despite their best attempts, none were able to contain the few tears that escaped their eyes and ran down their faces. Izuku wandered around the streets without really any course, as he did not want to return home just yet. As he was walking, he was startled when suddenly a sludge creature turned from one of the corners of a street and started to charge toward him. "The hostage?" the creature exclaimed excitedly. "Hostage? Don't tell me," Izuku suddenly realized what he had gotten himself involved in. A sludge tentacle suddenly tried to catch Izuku, but he managed to duck under it with his reflexes, avoiding being captured. A sludge creature, which means physical attacks don't work on him. Izuku quickly observed and analyzed the monster. The eyes, they are physical. Izuku took off his backpack and ran toward the sludge monster, avoiding capture from another tentacle. When he was close enough, he smacked the sludge monster on the eyes, which caused it to twirl back in pain. "Ugh, my eyes," the sludge monster screeched. "Do you have any idea how much that hurts?" "I am here." Izuku then heard All Might's booming voice coming from behind the sludge monster. Izuku jumped back and to the side because he had figured that. Hexcss smash. All Might punched the air, and the wind pressure caused the sludge monster to explode into a million pieces. All Might looked around when the dust settled, and he saw Izuku standing there, looking at him, unimpressed. "Izuku?" All Might was surprised to see his stepson there. "What are you doing here?" "Good to see you too," Izuku said. "Where is your sister?" All Might asked. Izuku looked down. "We kind of fought and went our separate ways." "Fought?" All Might asked. Never had he ever heard the two half-siblings fight, ever, so this was news to him. "Well, that just won't do," All Might said. All Might disappeared, and then reappeared in a matter of seconds. All Might was now holding a giant Coke bottle which contained the sludge monster. Izuku raised an eyebrow when he saw the way the villain had been captured. "I will deliver this guy quickly to the police station, you stay here, I will be back in no time to bring you home," All Might exclaimed. This caused Izuku to clench his fists and frowned. "No thanks, I may not have a quirk, but I'm not helpless, I can walk my ass to the house without help, thank you very much," Izuku said in a harsh tone before walking away. All Might was stunned. He had never heard Izuku talk to him like that, or anyone for that matter, he was always kind and soft. All Might sighed. "Is this what happens in puberty?" All Might wondered before looking up to the sky. "I really wish you were here. Maybe you would know how to deal with this." All Might gave another sigh before jumping away to a nearby building. Izuku may not want his protection, but he would still deliver this guy to the station and then keep a watch over Izuku. All Might jumped on a few more buildings before he started to cough up blood. "Shit," All Might cursed under his breath as he started to deflate. "I need to get this guy back to the police." All Might touched his pocket where he had placed the sludge monster, only to feel nothing. "You have to be kidding me." Meanwhile, on the ground, as Izuku was walking down the street, he suddenly saw a shadow towering behind him. His senses told him something was wrong, and so he quickly jumped back and turned around. There he saw the sludge monster from before glaring at him. Well, the sludge figure said. If it isn't the brat that almost made me get captured by All Might. The sludge said as a grin spread through his face. What the? Izuku was shocked, he took a step back from the surprise. You were captured, how did you escape? Izuku shouted. Well, you need more than a mere bottle to keep me down. The sludge monster said as he laughed. Now, I will make you pay for what you did to me. Izuku quickly took off his backpack while at the same time, he dodged a tentacle that stretched out to grab him. Still, the sludge monster was quicker this time, and with another tentacle, he grabbed Izuku's leg, preventing him from moving. With another tentacle, he grabbed Izuku's right arm, which was holding the backpack. The sludge monster then started to twist Izuku's arm around 360 degrees, causing it to bend unnaturally. Izuku felt like his bones that kept his arm connected to his body began to crunch and crack from the way his arm was twisted. The sludge monster continued to turn it, while agonizing pain started to come from Izuku's right side. The monster then grabbed a greater grip on Izuku's arm and started to pull it out. The excruciating amount of pain Izuku was feeling could not be compared to anything he had ever felt, but the worst was yet to come. Finally, after bending and pulling, Izuku's arm was detached from his body. A blood-curdling scream escaped Izuku's mouth as his arm went flying off after the sludge threw it away. A river of blood started to pour out of Izuku, who was barely conscious at this point. A white-hot blinding pain engulfed Izuku as tears began to trail down his face. I will rip and tear you apart from the inside out. The sludge then made its way to Izuku's open mouth and nose, and he started to get into Izuku's respiratory system, severely damaging it in the process. Izuku closed his eyes as he felt the darkness began to engulf him. So, this is it, huh? Izuku thought. His memories trailed back to the fight he had with Izumi earlier that day, and more tears started to form. Then, an image of Shako waving appeared before him. See you tomorrow. Izuku exclaimed in his memories. I'm sorry. Shako. Izuku thought as the image of Shako faded away. Lastly, an image of his mother smiling appeared in front of him. Mom. Here I come. Izuku closed his eyes, ready to embrace the eternal void, but then. The loud blast was heard, and Izuku heard as the sludge grunted in pain. Izuku fell to the ground, barely alive. Izuku managed to listen to a few steps coming toward him. Izuku then felt as he was picked up by someone. How sad. A stern, male voice said. You really are in bad shape, aren't you, Izuku Midoriya? The man said. Izuku could no longer open his eyes, so he could not see who was talking to him. But don't worry, for I am here. The man told him. I will help you, and in turn, I expect you to help me too. The man then began to walk away with Midoriya still in his arms. We will do great things in the future, you and I, we will be unstoppable. We will be partners, and we will be together. Forever. To make a mistake is only human, to persist in a mistake is idiotic. Cicero. A gust of wind passed through a desolated street of the city. All Might ran all over the city, frantically searching for the sludge villain that had escaped his grasp. There were not many people outside, as the sky over the city had darkened, and the sound of distant thunder announced an incoming storm. As All Might felt the first droplets fall on his skin, he cursed under his breath. I must do this quickly and make sure Izuku reached the house safely, All Might thought as he checked a street in less than a second. There weren't many places left for him to look over. After recovering some of his strength, he had started to check the more faraway areas of the city, as he guessed the villain would have tried to make a run for it and hid somewhere in the outskirts of the city. After exploring the outer areas and a bit out of the city, he decided to backtrack and check the whole place. As he moved at Mach speed, it was easier for him to cover much more ground in the least amount of time. When he passed by an alley, he caught a glimpse of something that caused him to stop dead in his tracks. As All Might turned around and went to look in the passage, the metallic smell of blood flooded his nose, causing him to gag for a moment before regaining his composure. He examined the site, there was blood all over the floor and on one of the walls. What happened here? All Might asked himself as he frowned. It almost seemed as someone had exploded in there. As he analyzed the scene, something caught his attention. Is that slime? All Might thought as he kneeled down to touch it. Now, closer to the floor, he noticed that there were bits of slime scattered all over the place. This can't be a coincidence. All Might took a phone out of his pocket and dialed a number. He brought the phone to his ear and waited for the person on the other side to answer. Hello? The voice of a man answered. Namasa, I need your help. I will send you my location, and I need you here as soon as possible. Make sure to bring a forensic team too, All Might exclaimed to his friend. On the other side of the line, the last bit made Namasa perk up. He sat correctly in his chair as he frowned. I'm on my way, stay there. Namasa hung the phone and stood up from his chair. On the alley, All Might placed his phone back in his pocket and frowned as he looked back at the scene. The image of the sludge monster's morbid smile appeared on his mind. Just what did you do? In the Yagi household. Izumi lied down on the couch of the living room as she rested against the back. Izumi looked up at the ceiling, but her eyes were not fixed on anything. Every time she remembered what had happened after the end of classes, she felt like something sharp pierced her in her chest. Today it had been the first time they had a fight. Sure, they would argue over things, but it had never escalated to something like that. Every time she remembered Izuku yelling at her, it hurt, but nothing hurt more than having to come to terms with the fact that she yelled at him as well, and possibly hurt him. I'm his sister, goddammit. Izumi said as she looked down and placed the back of her hand against her forehead. Her lips were trembling, and so were her hands. She felt as her eyes were starting to get watery. I'm supposed to be with him. Not leave him. Her hands curled into fists as she continued to tremble. Izumi brought her legs to her chest and buried her face in her knees. Her mind was busy imagining every possible scenario and what she could have done to make the situation better. I shouldn't have forced it on him. The words of All Might whispered to her in her mind. But I also don't want him to die. Confusion took hold of Izumi's thought process. What should I do? Izumi raised her head from her knees and looked at herself in the reflection of the turned-off TV. I must look for him. Izumi told herself. What did Izuku sometimes say? Izumi closed her eyes, thinking for a moment. Oh yeah. Izumi opened her eyes, the light was now back to them. Everyone makes mistakes, but a mistake only becomes a failure when you refuse to correct it. Izumi took a deep breath. I must apologize to him. I must listen to him. I must stand by him and be someone he can lean on. I must keep our promise. There was a sound coming down the hall, someone was opening the door. This caused Izumi to perk up. She stood up and walked toward the entrance. She saw the doorknob turning. Was it Izuku? Izumi felt as her heart started to beat faster and her hands began to tremble. Her breathing became harder as cold sweat started to drip down her face. She was at the border of hyperventilating. Things were moving slow. Izumi swallowed, getting her breathing and her heartbeat back under control. The door opened. To Izumi, it seemed like time had slowed down as she watched the door move. Her eyes widened as she saw Toshinori step into his house, an umbrella in hand, looking dejected. Hi Dad, Izumi greeted him, although she was not too enthusiastic to see him. Oh, hello Izumi, Toshinori said as he stepped into the house and closed the umbrella. Izumi eyed him cautiously. If Toshinori was here, then could Izuku also be there too? Izumi looked as Toshinori closed the door behind him. Something's wrong. Izumi narrowed her eyes as she looked at her dad. Tell me, Toshinori started. Is Izuku around? Toshinori had suspected that Izuku would have already reached the house by the time he left the police station. Izumi felt a chill go down her spine at the question. Wait. Izumi said before she swallowed. Izuku isn't with you? Toshinori froze in place. What? Toshinori thought in his head as he turned his head to look at Izumi. So. Izuku isn't here? Izumi slowly nodded her head. If he isn't with Dad then. Where is he? What happened? Is he okay? Izumi thought as she started to tremble again, the cold sweat returning to her face. Dad. Where is Izuku? Izumi said, her voice cracking midway. Toshinori was petrified. The image of the alley and the blood returned to his mind. That was just a coincidence. Right. Toshinori felt as what remained of his stomach dropped. Dad. Where is Izuku? Izumi exclaimed loudly as she looked at her father. Izumi looked at him helplessly as she raised her eyebrows and her mouth gaped. Izumi felt as her eyes grew tired, feeling as she would pass out. Come on, Toshinori said sternly as he opened the door and took his umbrella. Toshinori stepped out of the house and opened the umbrella, which now shielded him from heaven's cries. We must find him. Toshinori then began to walk away. As if something had struck her, Izumi regained control of her emotions and quickly grabbed her own umbrella. Izumi didn't care that she was practically in pajamas, nor about the possibility of getting sick, she only cared about one thing, Izuku. With such a goal in mind, she walked in the ferocious tempest. As Toshinori struggled to walk through the dreadful storm, he coughed into his hand. When he looked down at it, he saw the reddish-brown droplets of blood that covered his hand. The horrendous image of the alley passed through his head once more. Toshinori continued to walk, taking his phone out of his pocket. He dialed Namasa's number and brought his phone to his ear, waiting for the detective to answer. Namasa. Toshinori practically yelled as he was gasping for air. No. I need the results of the DNA test from the alley. I need them now. Toshinori struggled to keep himself on his feet as the rain and the wind threatened to wash him away. On the other side of the line, Naomasa grew tense. He had never heard Toshinori talk like that before. I will see what I can do. The moment I have them, I will call you. Please. Toshinori said in a tired tone. I need those results. I need to know. As he said that, Toshinori hung the phone and continued to move forwards. I can't lose you. I won't lose you too. The storm continued as the opera of the skies, the instruments determined to sing out, and the trees and grasses as their percussion. It was a twirl of perfect black ballet dancers, each dressed in windswept gray. They danced to the roar of heaven's drum and called lightning to their stage. Izumi sat on a chair in the police station, looking numbly at the floor. The policeman had been kind enough to give her a towel with which she could cover herself with. The umbrellas had not been sufficient to protect her from the force of nature that raged outside. Toshinori sat next to her, a towel around him as well. He chewed on his nails. Naomasa had told them that the results were almost ready. Izumi received an enormous impact when Toshinori told her the possibility of Izuku being dead from the sludge monster attack. I refused to believe it. Izumi thought as her gaze was fixated on the floor. She had bags under her eyes as they had been searching for Izuku the entire day before without rest. Her strength was slowly fading away. The door to Naomasa's office and the detective stepped out. The moment Naomasa saw father and daughter in such pitiful states, he averted his eyes, turning around to close the door. Naomasa stood looking at the door for some time. This made Izumi and Toshinori wary. Naomasa. What's going on? Toshinori asked. There was still some hope in his heart, but his reason told him otherwise. Naomasa turned around to face father and daughter. He swallowed thickly and opened his mouth, but no words came out. Naomasa struggled for a few seconds as the sentence refused to leave his mouth. Naomasa. Tell me whose blood that was. Toshinori demanded as he stood up and grabbed the shoulders of his friend. Toshinori's eyes looked desperately at Naomasa, hoping for an answer. Naomasa choked on his own words. It was his. Naomasa looked down, avoiding Toshinori's eyes. Toshinori's arms fell limply to his side as the color of his face faded away. No. Toshinori said as he looked up at the ceiling. The image of mother and son appeared on his mind. I lost them. Toshinori fell to his knees, his gaze now fixated on the nothingness. I lost them both. Meanwhile, Izumi stared at Naomasa with wide eyes, a petrified expression in her face. You are joking, right? Izumi finally managed to say. This is all a joke, isn't it? Izumi smiled as her thoughts tried to convince her that what she had heard was not true at all. Naomasa felt as something stabbed him in the chest. It was already difficult having to say it the first time. He simply shook his head as he avoided looking at Izumi. Naomasa hated this part of his job. Izumi's smile faded away, and so did the light in her eyes, which briefly came back. And so, the pressure was too much, the dam broke, and the waterfall was let loose. Izumi felt like her world shattered in front of her. It was too much for her already exhausted body, and suddenly everything turned pitch black. Izumi began to fall back from the chair she was in. Naomasa quickly glanced up and saw Izumi falling down to the ground. The detective reacted speedily and ran past a frozen Toshinori still kneeling, and he managed to catch Izumi before she hit the floor. A medic. Bring a medic. Naomasa shouted to his subordinates, who were watching the scene in perplexity. Naomasa looked down at Izumi, and then he looked back at Toshinori. Naomasa closed his eyes, cursing under his breath as the workers had finally snapped out of their shock and went to aid the detective. The deluge had been raging for a week, its incessant winds attacking the city, along with the waterfall of the sky. They had all convinced themselves that Izuku had died in that alley, murdered by the sludge monster as an act of revenge. Nobody could have survived after losing so much blood unless they received help immediately. The funeral had been more of a memorial, with nobody to bury. There were only pictures and an empty casket, which was added to give a sense of normality to the funeral. The grieving part had been the worst, as, without a body to bury, it was still challenging to associate the idea of death with someone whose body hadn't been found. Even, all the evidence presented indicated that Izuku would have more than likely died a few minutes after he started to bleed. Izumi sat alone, away from the bulk of people, or well heroes, who had come to give their condolences to All Might. Izumi couldn't help but realize that most of those condolences seemed half-assed, and that they were only trying to get into All Might's good grace, rather than actually helping him through his grief. Izumi scoffed at the sight. If only there had been a hero there. Izumi thought as she scowled. If only I was there. A pain appeared in her chest at the thought. Her eyes were becoming watery again, but she prevented herself from crying once more. Her eyes already hurt enough from spending practically the entire last week in hysterical cries as she denied the possibility of Izuku being dead. She wandered the city like an errant spirit, searching for Izuku, looking to maintain their promise, but she found no one, she only found herself alone. Izumi felt a hand on her shoulder, causing her to look back in surprise. There she saw Shako. They hadn't seen each other in the past week, not since Izumi told her what had happened. Her eyes were visibly red too. Crying is a cleansing of one's soul, a rebonding with our vulnerable selves, a chance to realize what suffering and pain are for you. And for others. So this is what happens when heroes fail. Izumi thought. Shako sat next to Izumi in an empty chair. There were no words spoken in between them, they both knew exactly how each other was feeling, and so they said nothing, just silently comforting each other. A few minutes of silence passed, with only the rain's soothing sound, the natural melody every bit as beautiful as a mother's soulful hum. Finally, Shako decided to break the ice. What? She stuttered. What are you planning to do? Shako still looked down at the floor, not being able to look up at Izumi. I will do what any hero would, I will protect the weak, the vulnerable, the people who are loved by those around them, Izumi started. I will fight against those who do injustice, so those that can't fight won't have to. This caused Shako to look up at Izumi. I will achieve nothing by just sitting here and think about the what-ifs. In a sense that is what got us to this situation in the first place. Izumi remembered all the times she tried to push Izuku away, afraid of hurting him. This world will always be full of injustice, but if I have the time to give up or hold a grudge against those injustices, then I indeed have the time to stand up and fight against such injustices. Izumi looked down at her hand, clenching it into a fist. And what plans do you have to achieve this? Shako asked as she raised an eyebrow. I will become the #1 hero, Izumi started. With such a position, I will have enough influence to cause the change necessary in the hero system. No more fake heroes will be allowed, only those capable and willing to truly save those in danger, not from a lust of power or fame, but because they really want to have a positive impact in this world, Izumi said as she frowned. Heroes such as your father, this caused Shako to tense up at the remainder of Endeavor. They will have no such place in my world, Izumi closed her eyes and sighed. That way, what happened to Izuku, and the pain we feel, will never be again. Shako looked at Izumi, shocked for a moment, but then she smiled fondly at her friend. Shako placed her hand once again on Izumi's shoulder. In that case, you will need help, Shako stated. This caused Izumi to perk up and look up at her. Shako chuckled at her reaction. You can't do everything alone. I will be there too, standing next to you, and supporting you. Izumi smiled at Shako as she felt the tears starting to form again in her eyes, which she quickly suppressed. Thank you. Shako chuckled once again. You don't need to thank me, we made a promise, remember? Shako said as she smiled. We will reach the top, together. Is there room for one more? A female voice said. Izumi and Shako turned around to look at the front, and there they say a pretty blonde girl with blue eyes. Melissa. Izumi exclaimed, her mouth opened. She really not expected her to be here. Not that she was bothered by it, after all, it had been a year since the last time they saw each other. I made a promise too, remember? Melissa asked. Yes, I remember, Izumi said, remembering the first time they met 11 years ago. I may not have a quirk, Melissa started. So I won't be able to help you on the battlefield directly, but I do have the ability to help from the sidelines with my equipment, so please, let me support you with everything I have. Melissa exclaimed. Izumi looked up at Melissa, and she saw the small tears that were falling down her cheeks. Izumi smiled at her and stood up, placing a hand on the shoulder of the taller girl. We will make this world a better place, a place where Izuku could have lived happily, Izumi said. Melissa looked at her and nodded her head. Shako looked down, the smile she had fading away. Her mind trailed back to the last words Izuku told her. See you tomorrow. The beaming image of Izuku as he smiled appeared on her mind. I really wish to have seen you one last time. That way. Maybe I would have been able to express this feeling I have for you. The beeping sound of a pulse oximeter reverberated around the room. There was a single white bulb which illuminated the place. The lights pierced the eyes of Izuku, who lied on a hospital bed. As the light started to disturb him in his sleep, he began to open his eyes. Izuku blinked for a few times. Izuku began to sit back up, and instinctively, he tried to lift himself using his right arm. As he sat up, he then felt, or rather, not felt, his right arm. He looked to his side and saw a prosthetic metal arm. Izuku brought his new prosthetic up, staring wide-eyed at it. He began to remember how his arm was forcibly removed from his body. Izuku closed his hand a few times and scrutinized it. Izuku then felt something on his nose. Izuku brought his left arm and touched his nose, feeling a few tubes coming out of it. He followed the pipes, and he saw they were connected to something at his back. Izuku brought his arm and touched his back, feeling like a small tank strapped to his back. What? What happened? Izuku brought his flesh arm to his head and gripped it, trying to remember. Izuku remembered the sludge, the pain, and then, nothing. No, there was something else he remembered, a man, but who was this person? The doors of the room opened, causing Izuku to tense as he went on guard. A man stepped in, he wore a black suit without a tie. He was tall and bulky, but what caught Izuku's attention the most was wearing a pipe mask that covered his entire face. "Oh, you are awake now," the mysterious man said in a calm yet firm tone. Izuku eyed him carefully. "Who are you?" "Ah yes, my apologies. I'm the person who saved you when you were brutally assaulted by that vile sludge creature," the man started. "I go by many names, but I am mostly referred to by one. My name is All for One." Izuku widened his eyes, his senses going on high alert. "All for One?" Izuku thought. "The underground villain?" Izuku asked. "Of course, the one and only, All for One," replied, a bit amused by the boy's reaction. "I see you really have been one of the few to have been able to find out about my existence." "All records say All for One died after his battle with All Might 14 years ago," Izuku stated as he narrowed his eyes. "Do I look dead to you?" All for One asked as he extended his arms to his sides. "No," Izuku narrowed his eyes once again. "But, how can I know you really are All for One?" "Cautious, I like that," All for One told him. A few spikes popped out of one of All for One's arms, which were then covered in flames, and the muscles of his other arm grew bigger, while claws appeared from his hand. "Multiple quirks," Izuku said in awe as he looked at All for One. All for One deactivated his quirks. "Indeed, so, did that convince you?" "I guess so," Izuku said, but he still didn't lower his guard. "Tell me, why did you save me?" Izuku said as he narrowed his eyes. "Because I like you," All for One simply said. "Like me?" Izuku asked as he raised an eyebrow. "Why would this godlike villain have taken a liking into me?" Izuku thought a bit weirded out. "Yes, let me straight with you," All for One started his explanation as his tone shifted to a more serious one. "I've been observing you for some time now, and I admire the level of skill you have, despite your age. In you, I see a raw, untamed potential, and beyond that, something truly special that I just couldn't let go to waste." All for One let out a small chuckle. "You, my boy, are a rare gem in between rare gems. Despite not possessing a quirk, your intellect rivals, perhaps even surpasses that of UA's principal, Nezu. Beings such as you, who have the potential to change the course of human history, only appear once every several generations. I just couldn't let your abilities be wasted with people who don't even see you as an equal." Izuku scoffed at the reminder of how Izumi had been treating him for the past years. Izuku did not hate Izumi, but he was upset by her behavior. He knew Izumi cared for him, he really did, but it still saddened him, as all he wanted to do was stand by side with her and to keep their promise. He knew that he may be weaker than the average heroes and villains when it came to physical strength, but that didn't mean he couldn't find a way to even the battlefield. Still, if Izumi didn't want him to stand with her, then fine, he will stand against her, and he will prove to her just how capable he actually is, and maybe, in the way, they will be able to join forces and be together once again. Even so, the idea of joining a supervillain was not something Izuku particularly liked. "I've wanted to be a hero all my life," Izuku started. "All I've wanted to do is to help people, to create positive change, and that way, I could make this hell of a world just a bit more of a better place." Izuku then raised his head and looked at All for One directly where he supposed his eyes should be. "If that is my ultimate goal, then why would I want to join the symbol of evil?" Izuku said, glaring at the villain. There was a small pause, but then All for One began to laugh, surprising the young boy. "You're still so naive, my boy," All for One said in between laughs. When he finally regained his composure, All for One looked directly at Izuku's eyes. "Evil?" All for One still said a bit amused. "What is that? Who gives more shape to human history? The good, who adhere to the tried and true? Or those who seek to rouse being from their conformity and lead them to glory? Those willing to wash away the old and complacent and purge this world of dead weight?" All for One let his words sink in and then began to walk around the room. "Heroes," All for One continued. "Crippled by greed, shackled to obedience, to their masters, their governments. They perpetuate a myth of safety, serving their government as if it was programmed into them, instead of the people they supposedly work to protect. A nation can't be set on its proper course until the heroes and their corrupt government have been brought down." All for One then turned around to look at Izuku. "For decay has no cure, it has to be eradicated by the flames of a cleansing fire." Izuku looked at All for One in surprise. Izuku had to give it to him, he was right. The words resonated inside his head. If he wanted to bring the change he so desired into this world, he could not bound himself by the laws of the system. He would have to rise up and shake the society from its foundations, and when the pieces all come crashing down, he will pick them up one by one, and from the mess it once was, he will rebuild the world into something beautiful. "You are right on that, the state is no longer what it once was. The state is not what was important, ever," All for One stated. "It was but a shell which surrounds the heroes, just like the teachings of the heroes are but a shell surrounding the hearts of humanity. If we bring down the heroes, the real colors of the government, which is full of greedy, squabbling bureaucrats, will be revealed to the people, and without the heroes to sustain them, the government will come crashing down and fall on the people in the process, breaking the world to its very core. And then, the pieces will be up for grabs, Izuku finished the statement. You are starting to get it, All For One said in a pleased tone. We both hate the current state of affairs, and both are the only ones with enough will to do something about it. This will be our world, my boy, our reality, All For One extended his hand towards Izuku. To be united by hatred, Izuku thought. It is a fragile alliance at best, Izuku looked at All For One's hand. I pledge myself to your teachings, Izuku said as he bowed his head. All For One retracted his hand. Very well, All For One stated. Together, we shall bring an end to this world, and from its ashes, build a new one where we will reign supreme, like master and apprentice. All For One turned around and walked toward the door. Now, rest, my apprentice, you need to recover your strength so we can start working as soon as possible, for time waits for no one. Understood, Izuku bit his lip. Master. All For One then opened the door and walked out of the room, closing the door behind him. Izuku remained sitting, glaring at the door. It's only natural that we will have a conflict of interests in the future, Izuku thought, and then furrowed his eyebrows. I will continue to study at your feet. I will learn from your wisdom. I will discover your secrets, until everything you know, all your knowledge, and all your assets, are mine. Outside of the room, All For One walked toward a window, and he saw the rainstorm was starting to dissipate. The first rays of light began to pierce the clouds. Did you convince him? A male voice said coming from the side. All For One turned around and saw Dr. Yujiko standing in the hall. Yes, where there was conflict, I now sense some resolve, All For One, then audibly sighed. Still, he remains naive, but it is my job to set him straight, All For One admitted to his old companion. He believes that it is possible to create peace in this world, All For One chuckled. Peace is a lie, there is only passion, and through passion, strength, victory, and through victory, my chains will be broken. That way, I will rise to my rightful place, for this world is mine, I just need to claim it once more. Then, we will reign together, and take the place which was stolen from me so many years before. All For One turned to the window once again, the dark clouds were mostly gone. I ignited a fire today, one that will consume the globe. The world will never see something like what is to come. From the flames, he shall rise from the ashes, like a true phoenix. And in his hellfire, the heroes will burn eternal. You may not be responsible for getting knocked down. But you're certainly responsible for getting back up. Bully Amos. Dr. Yujiko stood outside of the training room in which All For One and Izuku were. A few weeks had passed since they had taken the boy in, and since day one, they had been impressed by him. Yujiko oversaw the therapy of Izuku so that he could adequately use his synthetic arm. He had seen more people in his over 100 years of experience than he could count struggling to adapt to their new limbs, but Izuku was different. In just 2 weeks, he had correctly learned how to regulate how much strength he used. At first, he shattered countless glasses, but after the first week, he could shakily grab them, but there were still a few accidents, and by the second week, it was like his arm was never gone. The artificial respiratory system Yujiko had first created also limited Izuku quite a lot, as it was nowhere near efficient to what nature had created. Here, another of Izuku's talents manifested itself. After sitting for a week, revising the plans Yujiko had lent him, he managed to create a system 4 times as efficient as Yujiko's, and thrice as compact. It was undoubtedly a groundbreaking advancement. In the third week, All For One started taking Izuku into the training room, as there was no time to waste. Izuku already had the basics engraved into his head, now he just needed to develop them into another level. A week of training had passed, and things were progressing. As Yujiko waited for their training session to end, he heard as Izuku grunted in pain, and then many loud smashes as Izuku was presumably sent flying across the room. Then, there was a blast that shook the entire place, and then, silence. After a few minutes, the door opened, and a bruised Izuku walked out of the room, trembling while clutching to his side. Yujiko observed him, as it seemed like he would fall to the floor at any moment. When Izuku walked past him, Yujiko spoke. You already know where the medkit is, right? Yujiko asked him as Izuku merely glanced at him. I do, Izuku replied flatly as he continued to walk away. As Izuku disappeared into one of the rooms, with Yujiko still overseeing him, All For One stepped out of the training room while dusting off his suit. Yujiko turned back to look at his lord. You are quite extreme in his training, don't you think? Yujiko questioned. I'm simply doing what must be done for him to survive in the outside world, All For One plainly stated as he began to walk away, Yujiko following him. Life is cruel, why should the preparation for it be any different? All For One asked. Izuku knows this very well, and every time he fails here, he stands back up because Izuku is aware that out there he will only get one chance. You do have a point there, Yujiko pushed his glasses upwards. But his bruises are getting me worried. We don't want him becoming a total cyborg now, would we? Yujiko asked. Of course not, All for One replied. I will make sure Izuku gets the proper rest and that his wounds are well treated, All for One firmly stated. I've never quite seen you like this, Yujiko said. Not even with Shigaraki, Yujiko then faintly smiled. Well, I guess that is to be expected, considering he is your son, after all, right? All for One continued to walk. I remember how excited you were when the news of Inko being pregnant reached you. I never really thought you were even capable of feeling joy for something that wasn't seeing your schemes unfold, Yujiko mused. Are you sure you would be able to live with yourself if you ended up wounding him badly? All for One stopped walking and looked up, and he then audibly sighed. I was cheated out of my chance of being a proper parent from before he was born, All for One quietly said. I had to watch from the sidelines as the person who robbed me of my life raised my kid as if he was his own, All for One said with anger. I had to see as his life slowly fell apart while my hands were tied. All for One stated with regret. Now, I have the chance of helping my son succeed. Every punch hurts me as much as it hurts him, All for One looked down at his hands. But progress always requires sacrifice. All for One then continued to walk. But the reward will be great in the end, as we will both rule together in the future, not as master and apprentice, but as father and son. That is my vision. In his room, Izuku grabbed the medkit and started placing ointment and bandages over his worst bruised. Many of his injuries hurt quite severely, but it was nothing he couldn't endure, he just needed some rest. Still, it had been a while since he had experienced such pain, as Izumi had refused to train with him in fear of injuring him. He will prove to her that he can handle this pain and thrive through it. Maybe then, Izumi will accept him, and they will be able to go back to how things were, them working together. Oh, how he missed those days. Izuku fell back on his bed, but he was unable to fall asleep. He spun around the bed, but nothing, he had too much energy, so he decided to do something productive. Izuku grabbed a few books on mechanical engineering, provided by All for One, as he wanted to expand his knowledge. After an hour, though, he got bored, stood up from his bed and walked out of his room. Izuku began to wander around the place. He had never really seen much of the hideout. Izuku had only ever been in his room, the training room, and sometimes in Dr. Yujiko's office. Occasionally he heard voices that belonged neither to All for One nor Yujiko, so he assumed other people were inside the building too, probably lackeys, Izuku thought. Izuku didn't find any particularly interesting when he looked around the hideout. Everything was straightforward and boring. Maybe this was a bad idea, Izuku thought as he felt his eyes closing down from the boredom. I'll go back, Izuku thought while yawning and turning back. Suddenly, he felt as all his senses screamed to him in an alert. Izuku turned around and dodged a hand that tried to grab him. Izuku jumped back, but whoever had just attacked he continued to press us. Izuku escaped the hands as they tried to catch him. Izuku stepped to the side to avoid an attack, and he saw as when the person held a vase behind him, it started to disintegrate. Izuku tensed and jumped back, trying to put as much distance between him and this mysterious person. Still, that wasn't enough, as in a fraction of a second, the person had reached him. Izuku ducked under one of the attacks and punched the person away with his metal hand, not caring to regulate his strength. Izuku heard as something cracked on impact, and then the person fell back, grunting in pain. Izuku was surprised by something though, as the grunt was made by a female voice. Izuku eyed the downed person carefully. They were wearing a long black dress, had long light blue hair, and their face was pale and seemed to be dehydrated. Izuku was then startled by a door suddenly opening. Izuku turned around and saw All for One stepping out of a room. All for One looked at the scene in the hall and sighed. I should have known this would happen, All for One stated and shook his head slightly. Well, at least now we can be sure your training is starting to pay off. Izuku blinked. It was right if he hadn't been training with All for One, he wasn't sure if he would have dodged that last attack after the charge. The speed of that woman was remarkably fast. Ugh, the woman grunted as she grabbed her stomach and sat up. Master, the woman's rough voice spoke. Who the hell is this brat? I don't think I like him, the woman stated as she glared and growled at Izuku. Trust me, the feeling seems mutual, Izuku replied, glaring back at her. Now, Nana, All for One said as he stepped between them to prevent them from attacking each other. You are both my apprentices, so you should try to get along well, All for One declared. What? They both shouted. You never told me about this, Master. Nana cried out as she stood up. Her hands were curled into fists, and they were shaking with rage. I thought I was supposed to be your only apprentice. I don't really mind, Izuku said as he observed Nana with a bored expression. But, I don't know for how long I will be able to keep myself from plumbing this crybaby back into the ground, Izuku stated. Oh you wish, you damn broccoli boy. Nana shouted back. You were just lucky, that's it. Next time, I will disintegrate your ass, you hear me? Try me, you mummy-looking hag, Izuku replied as he narrowed his eyes. All for One sighed, it was time for him to place his foot down, literally. All for One stomped the ground, and the shockwave it caused was enough to startle Izuku and Nana. I will not be dealing with these temper tantrums, do you understand me? All for One stated in a commanding voice that was enough to shut Izuku and Nana up. They both frantically nodded. Very well, All for One said, now calmer. Now, I want you to shake hands and introduce yourselves. All for One looked at Nana, and while Nana couldn't see his face, she knew that All for One had an expression that screamed try anything, I dare you. Nana sighed and extended her hand, her pinky was raised away from her other fingers. I'm Nana Shigaraki, Nana said in a bored voice. My quirk is decay. If I touch anything with my 5 fingers, it will start to decay, and I can't control its spread. Izuku eyed Nana carefully before replying, as shaking the hand of someone who can be disintegrating you just by touching you, and after that same person just tried to kill you may not be a good idea. Izuku sighed, she wouldn't dare to do anything with All for One standing right there, would she? Izuku extended his metal hand and shook Nana's. I'm Izuku Midoriya. I'm quirkless, Izuku stated. Nana scoffed. Well, I guess you are not half bad for being a normie, Nana said. Still, you were just lucky. Izuku rolled his eyes. Whatever helps you sleep at night, corpse lady, Izuku replied. All for One quickly stepped in between them to prevent another fight. Alright, All for One said. I'm glad to see everything is fixed now. As fixed as the Middle East after an American intervention, Izuku said. You are both integral parts of this organization, All for One continued, ignoring Izuku's comment. We can't have you killing each other, so I don't think I will see you fighting again, right? Keyword. See, both Nana and Izuku thought. Izuku's light bulb then turned on. Excuse me, I never really asked, but of what organization are we exactly a part of? Izuku asked as he tilted his head. All for One looked at Izuku and then chuckled lowly. I didn't, my bad then, All for One extended his hands to his side. Welcome to the League of Villains. All for One exclaimed. Izuku was unimpressed. You seem to be lacking some personnel on the creativity department. All for One looked down at Izuku. Quite the cynical now, are you? All for One asked as he lowered his arms. Having a mustachio man yell at you constantly while you are trying to relearn almost everything can be quite taxing on your emotional state, Izuku replied. Not quite as taxing as the government, but close enough. Oh, trust me, boy, I know that feeling, All for One replied. Now, as part of you now officially being a member of the League of Villains, we will have to give you a small change of name. All for One brought his hand to his mask's chin and hummed for a few seconds. From now on, Izuku Midoriya is no more, you will now be Izuku Shigaraki. What? Nana shouted from the background. Izuku raised an eyebrow. Shigaraki? Izuku asked. Why name me after the unmoist crybaby? Listen here, you Nana was cut off by All for One's laughter. Silly boy, All for One said. I did not name you after her, All for One began. I named you after me, All for One said as he pointed towards himself. This actually surprised Izuku. Izuku blinked a few times before replying. Excuse me? Izuku asked, still processing what All for One had just said. All for One chuckled. Yes, Shigaraki is my last name. All for One exclaimed. And, as my apprentices, I believe it is the proper name for you to have, All for One said. Izuku thought for a second. As far as he was concerned, everyone who knew him thought he was lost, if not dead, so he would be in trouble if someone discovered his actual name. Very well then, Izuku said. I'll just have to get used to it. Oh, I'm sure that with time, you will grow fond of it, All for One replied. All for One then placed a hand on Nana's and Izuku's shoulders. We will accomplish great things. From now on, we are one, and together, we shall become the gods of the New World Order. Meanwhile, at the Yagi household. The house had been different for the past few days. It was like a void, a dark void. It was a never-ending dark void that consumes everything, so there is nothing. Empty, that's how the Yagi household felt. Izumi walked around the house, with loneliness at the vice of her heart, squeezing with just enough pressure to be a constant pain. Still, as time went on, the loneliness felt more like solitude, for one finds a way to cope. Yet to have the real company of someone you appreciate, that would be what she desires the most. Solitude is what comes when the pain of loneliness gives way to calm confidence, self-reliance, and a realization that when you take good care of yourself, you can take good care of others, and that is precisely what she plans to do. Izumi walked to Toshinori's room. Toshinori had been a mess for the last few weeks, it was honestly sad seeing who once was such a might hero fall so low. Izumi knocked, but when there was no response, she simply walked in. Their All Might laid in his bed, a broken man, a remnant of the once great hero. "Dad?" Izumi asked as she walked into the messy room. There were shirts and other clothes piled on the ground and wraps of various unhealthy foods. "May I talk to you about something?" Izumi walked and stood near the edge of Toshinori's bed. Toshinori perked up and sat upon his bed. "Would you choose another career path?" Toshinori asked with a glint of hope in his voice. "No," Izumi replied, shaking her head. But Toshinori tried to continue, but Izumi raised her hand in a stop sign. "Dad, we already talked about this," Izumi stated firmly. "I'm not changing career paths, and that is that," Izumi replied and then sighed when she saw the look of sadness in her father's eyes. "Look, I know being a hero is a dangerous job, but I want to do it," Izumi replied. "I want to help people, and this is the only career that allows me to use my abilities to their fullest," Izumi said as she looked down at her hands before clenching them. "I also want to honor Izuku and change the world so that what happened to him doesn't happen again." Izumi breathed in and looked at her father with determination. "That is why, despite my previous stance on it and after careful consideration, I would like to take you up on the one for all offer," Izumi said. This caused Toshinori to beam with happiness, but before he could say anything, Izumi stopped him. "But, I'm not doing this because of you," Izumi stated. "I still believe that power should have been given to my brother," Izumi firmly said. "But, to fulfill my goals, I will need every possible advantage I can get." "Yes, sure, Toshinori exclaimed. "I don't care for your motives, as long as you take it," Toshinori desperately pleaded. Izumi sighed. "Dad, you do know that one for all won't make me immortal, right?" "I am aware," Toshinori replied. "But with it, you will be safer, and it will also be like if you are carrying a part of my soul with you wherever you go, and that will put me at ease," Toshinori calmly stated. Izumi sighed. "Very well, whatever helps you sleep at night, old man." Toshinori chuckled and then transformed into his muscle form. "Now for you to gain the mighty powers of one for all you must do is to." All Might cut a strand of his hair from his head. "Eat this." Izumi was thunderstruck as if a bombshell had just exploded a few meters away from her. Her face was that of a kindergartner being taught quantum physics. Izumi looked at her father, and amidst all the confusion of trying to process the words her father had just uttered, all she could let out was a faint what. Meanwhile, on the other side of the story, Izuku looked at All for One the same way Izumi looked at All Might. "Excuse me?" Izuku asked. "As you heard," All for One replied. All for One was currently sitting on his chair. "The path you are heading is one few can't turn back from, and few believe to be redeemable. From now on, you will walk in the shadows. But, do not fret, the shadow does not judge, it forgives, it understands, as long as you learn to embrace it, as, at the end of this road, the shadow is all you will have left," All for One explained. Now, All for One extended a sword and a gun to Izuku. "Kill them." Izuku stood in front of a house, it was the middle of the night, and only the bright moon and the pale stars illuminated. It was a lovely house, a small house, but comfy nonetheless. Izuku was wearing a jacket and trousers. His face was covered by a black mask and also wore dark gloves. Inside the house, a family of 3 resided, and they were currently eating dinner. There was the mother, the father, and the son. The kid is who we are interested in, his name, Mori Katsumoto, quirk. The last Avengers. One of Bakugo's lackeys, and a part of his main tormentors. Izuku breathed in deep, and he readied the gun he had brought in and walked towards the door. Inside the house, the family was peaceful, but it was all about to change. The booming sound of a gun being fired was heard, and the lock of their door fell down. The door was suddenly kicked open by Izuku, who stormed into the place. "Stand back." The father shouted to his kid and wife as he stood up from his chair. "Listen, we can talk." Izuku fired the man on the chest, and he felt his urge to vomit increase. The bullet wound looked nothing like he had expected. Instead of a neat reddened hole, as it was oozing with dark red blood. The man fell to the ground with a loud thud, and the mother and Mori screamed in terror. "Please, no. No." The mother cried in terror as she hugged her son. She continued to plead, but Izuku remained determined. He was given a mission, and he would go through with it. Izuku aimed his gun and shot. The entry wound was dead center to her neck, perfection, a professional hit, no doubt. The training really paid off. The sound of more blood entering the environment was enough to trigger Izuku's gag reflexes again, though, but he managed to keep his composure. Mori looked horrified at the dead body of his mother lying right next to him. There were rivers on his face. Mori turned to look at Izuku. "Who are you? Who are you?" Mori shouted. Izuku removed his mask, revealing his face to his old aggressor. No. Mori shook his head as he looked at Izuku's eyes. "You died. You should be dead." Mori screamed at the top of his lungs. I have returned, Izuku replied before impaling Mori in the stomach and in such a way that it would take minutes before he died out of blood loss. And I am a dark phoenix, Izuku said before removing the sword from Mori's stomach and walking away. Izuku stood in front of Mori's house, and after pouring some gasoline he had brought outside the house, he lit up a matchstick into it. Flames rose into the night as if they challenged the heavens to stop their house consumption and what was once a place of sanctuary. Yet the fire was impatient, and the heavens breathed eons and moments as if they were one. Meanwhile, the family's bodies were now no more than macabre confetti over the rocky ground, every eye flung wide in a final moment of terror, seeing nothing but blackness, despite the lurid light of the fire. Izuku looked at the flames as they spread, dancing and taking everything they could with them. Izuku turned around and walked away, disappearing into the warmth of the shadow. The path of your life can change in an instant. And brochures. Izuku was thrown across the training room by a wind blast. He landed on the wall, causing him to cough up as his back made contact with the wall. Izuku was landed on his knees, and with his arms, he prevented his head from hitting the ground. Izuku was panting hard, it was difficult for him to breathe already with the artificial system, but now with the pain that burned in his back, it was much worse. Izuku looked up, and he saw All For One standing in the middle of the room. Izuku did his best to impulse himself, but he could no longer move his arms, and so, he fell to the floor. You appear to be tired, All For One plainly stated. Oh, really? Izuku asked in between breaths. We will leave your training here, All For One said. I do not want you dying on me, after all. How considerate, Izuku replied as he slowly but surely rose up to his feet. You were rougher today. Izuku said. You could have warned me. Consider it, my congratulations on a job well done, All For One said. If this is your definition of a reward, I'm not sure if I want to succeed next time, Izuku replied, now fully standing. All For One chuckled. You passed my test, and now you are truly in the organization, All For One replied. I can no longer go easy on you, All For One explained. Life is hard and cruel, and so I believe your training shouldn't be any different. I am preparing you for what is out there because, trust me, boy, you have only seen the tip of the iceberg. All For One began to walk around the room. I am your master, All For One began. But I am also your torturer, All For One stated. From now on, you will make every effort to appease me, so appease me, boy, All For One, then sat down on a chair that was in the room. Tell me again how you killed them. Izumi and Shako sat down in a secluded part of the school's massive yard. It was a lovely spot, surrounded by bushes and covered by a chorus of green trees dancing in a celebratory wind, and each of them ever ignited by sunlight. It was perfect, it was calming, just being there brings the soul into sweet surrender, at one with nature, vibrant yet relaxed. Every fragrance is fresh, like the page of a new book. The girls ate their lunch, unbothered by the distant sound of chattering. Izumi and Shako came here to escape the river of people that flood the school. Not many people know of that spot they are in, so it is the perfect place to go and release tension. It helps them escape the boys' lustful gawking eyes and the girls' hateful envious eyes. There, they didn't have to worry about anything, so they could talk and laugh freely to their heart's content. As they were talking, Shako remembered something she had meant to ask Izumi. Hey, Izumi, Shako asked, calling Izumi by her nickname. When is Melissa coming? Izumi swallowed a noodle she was eating and cleaned her mouth. A few weeks before the entrance exam for UA, despite her grades, she still needs to take the test, Izumi explained. Still, she will have to join from the first year, as she needs to know also about the industry. I see, Shako replied. And does she know about your little power boost? Shako asked as she placed some rice on her mouth. Shako was let into the one for all secret by Izumi, as she didn't want to lie to her best friend. Not yet, Izumi replied. I would rather tell her in person when she comes, Izumi explained. Oh, I see, Shako replied. They both continued to eat, but then Izumi realized something that wasn't there the day before. Shako had new bandages on her arm. Izumi raised an eyebrow. Did your father do something to you again? Izumi asked. Shako froze for a second as her whole body tensed up. Shako lowered her head, and then she gave a small nod which causes Izumi to sigh. You should report him to the police or something, you know. Izumi replied. Because if you don't, I sure as hell will, Izumi said. Her hands were slightly shaking while curled up in fists. Rage, that is all she felt when she thinks about Endeavor. The number 2 hero abusing his own children so that they will achieve what he was unable to because of his cowardice. What a cruel joke. There are 2 types of heroes. Those genuinely doing it out of selflessness and those who are just there to rip off the benefits that such a position brings. Her anger threatens to explode when she thinks about the second group, which is far more common than she would like. Still, she will use that anger and channel it into her passions, making it a rocket fuel to create a better world. When she is at the top, she will use her influence to push the change society needs, and her first act of puppeteering behind the scenes will be to make sure that none of these fake heroes can hold the title of hero. And for those who have brought pain, then it won't be an eye for an eye, it will be an eye for two eyes. Shako had tensed up even more at Izumi's words. Please, don't, Shako quickly replied. It won't be of any use. Shako said. They will never believe us. He is the number 2 hero, they won't prosecute him for anything. Not even for murder, trust me, I know. Izumi sighed. Fine, we'll leave it at this for now, Izumi said. What about your brother? Well, he is. There. Shako replied. We haven't really talked anymore. Ever since the time you and Izuku kicked him when he threatened to punch me, Shako explained. Izumi couldn't hide the smile that memory brought her. It was just a few years ago. Shako talked with Izuku at the departure time, so she accidentally took a bit too much time talking with him. This enraged Shoto, as he had explicitly told Shako to be ready at a particular hour, and he wouldn't tolerate this defiance as he called it. Shoto found Shako and Izuku and grabbed her by the hair and threatened to punch her. Shako, not being the confrontative type, just took the scolding, but Izuku would take none of that. Having already mastered the basics of hand-to-hand combat, he punched Shoto in the face and pushed him away. Shoto was even more enraged by this further defiance, and so he retaliated. Having been trained by Endeavor for years, Shoto was not exactly a pushover either, so fighting commenced. They both landed some solid punches on each other, but they were at a stalemate. That is when Izumi joined up, not even bothering to ask questions, and she, along with Izuku, kicked Shoto up. Needless to say, ever since that day, Shako was mostly left alone by her brother. Izumi frowned and looked down, oh how she wished she could do that to Endeavor too. Still, the day when she will get to see all he had built crumble is probably going to be one of the best days of her life. Endeavor has not only damaged her best friend and corrupted, who was once a part of their group, but he has also lied and cheated his way to the top. There can be no compassion for someone like him. There shall be no mercy. Shako walked down the street alone. Shako often takes quite some time to reach her house, as she has no hurry to go into such a place. It once housed several happy memories, but that now just serves as a house of torture. Long has it been since the light of life left that godforsaken place. Currently, only shadows adorn it. For some, the shadows can be so welcoming, for they offer a chance to dwell in diffused rays, to rest. All shadows may do is mute colors, soften the volume of the daytime orchestra. Shadows are a guest, it is your choice to embrace them. Well dependent on the shining sun, a passing memento to become nothing at all under the starlit night, in truth, they tell more of golden rays than darkness. For other thought, the shadow brings grimness and dread. It is a darkness that robs you of your best sense and replaces it with a paralyzing fear. Still, but it isn't the darkness or being alone in it that brings fear, it is the fact that we may not be alone in it. For when Shako opens the door of her house, there, she sees him. From now and forevermore, All For One's booming voice said as he stood in the middle of the training room. You shall be known as Dark Phoenix, All For One proclaimed. He who rose from the ashes, crawling his way back from hell to return to the lands of the living, not as himself, but as a darker version of himself, for the darkness that was once trapped in his shell, has now been released, All For One said. Izuku, kneeling in front of All For One, stood up straight and looked at him. Thank you, my master, Izuku said. I shall carry this name with great honor, for the Dark Phoenix shall become the symbol of the new era. Very well, All For One replied. From now on, you shall also carry many titles, All For One said. While Nana will retain the position as head of the League of Villains, you shall bear the titles of Chief Strategist and Chief Fabricator, All For One exclaimed. I need Yujiko to focus on another project of mine, so you will be taking up his role. You will have access to the vast resources we still have available to us, and as Chief Strategist, you shall be the one in charge of planning any operations we may want to do in the future. From now on, you shall also have more autonomy to do your own thing. Several weeks have passed since your official joining of the league now, and you have shown promise in your training, so I trust you to survive out there. Yes, my master, Izuku replied, although he still didn't get used to calling anyone master. Very well, All For One replied. You will now begin to light up the matchsticks that will eventually become the all-consuming fire that will cleanse this society from its impurities. Izuku stood in the middle of the training room alone. All For One had departed to do whatever he does, so Izuku had space for himself. Izuku had asked Yujiko to lend him some training bots, as he wants to see how he would do against someone who isn't All For One. 5 training robots surrounded him, he wanted to start with a challenge. Izuku closed his eyes and breathed in deep. When Izuku opened his eyes, the robots were already charging at him, moving at speeds that were beyond human. Izuku ducked under the punch of them, and then he stopped the knee of one of the other robots using his metal arm. Another of the robots caught Izuku from behind and lifted him. Izuku struggled against the robot, but he was unable to escape. Another robot charged at him, ready to hit him while he was pinned. Meanwhile, Izumi also dodged one of the kicks from a training robot she had acquired on the other side of the city. Izumi then uppercut the robot, completely ripping off its head and sending it flying across the room. The robot's body fell to the ground, but Izumi had no time to relax as from behind her, a robot kicked her on the back, sending her flying across the room. Izumi spun in the air to face the robot and extended her hand. As the robot charged against Izuku, using his legs, he deflected the punches from the tin can, deflecting and blocking. Then he managed to kick both of the robot's arms away, creating an opening, and Izuku took his change to kick the robot in the chin. As the robot began to fall down, Izuku using his two legs, kicked the robot and used the momentum to push himself backwards and land on his feet. The robot that was holding onto him still did not let go, but it was easier for Izuku to break away from its grasp in that position. When he did, Izuku immediately elbowed the robot on its forehead with his metal arm several times. When the robot fell to the ground, Izuku lifted his foot and then he stomped on the robot's head, utterly shattering it. Izuku looked up and saw as the 4 remaining robots resumed their charge against him. When Izumi extended her hand while she was spinning, an energy blast left her hand, and when it impacted the robot, it exploded into several pieces that flew in the air and then rained back upon the training room. Izumi landed on her feet, but she then had to block an incoming punch from another robot. She raised her arms in the form of an X to cover her face, but she was still sent flying and ended up landing roughly against a wall. Izuku charged back against the remaining robots, and as he did, one of them threw a punch at him. When that happened, Izuku ducked under it and then he took the opportunity to swipe its legs off the ground, and he did that, and the robot began to fall. Izuku rose up, and then as the robot was falling, Izuku delivered an axe kick right into the robot's head. The robot's head shattered upon impacting against the floor. A robot charged against Izuku, and when it was at the correct distance, it threw a kick at Izuku. Izuku spun around it, and as the kick passed him, Izuku grabbed the robot's leg with his metal arm, holding it in a leg lock. Izuku then fell on his back and brought the robot to the ground with him. Once there, Izuku pulled the robot's leg to his side and started to rip it off. Finally, after much tugging, Izuku managed to pull off the robot's leg. Izuku rolled on the ground, but then he quickly stood up. Izumi pulled herself off the wall, but she was grabbed by one of the robot's throat as she did. Izumi was lifted by the robot and she was then pushed down to the ground. The robot kept making pressure, so it was difficult for her to breathe, causing her to turn purple, but Izumi would not let this be the end of her. Using the energy inside her body, Izumi channeled it into an electrical discharge that caused the robot to reboot for a moment. This opening allowed Izumi to kick the robot away from her. As the robot flew mid-air, its system rebooted and it managed to land on its feet. Izumi looked at the robot and extended her hand. Doing what she had done previously, she channeled her internal energy into lightning bolts which then impacted the robot. The robot systems were fried and it fell limply into the ground. Izumi turned around and saw a kick that was closing in towards her face. As Izuku stood up, he was punched in the face by another one of the robots. Izuku was dazed by the punch, which caused him to lower his guard. Izuku was then kneed on the same robot's stomach, which caused him to spit saliva and some blood. Izuku fell back and rested against a wall. Izuku looked up and saw the robot's punch descending towards his face. Izuku managed to recover enough to react, and he rolled around to dodge the punch, which broke through the wall. Izuku stood up and, using the leg he had stolen from the other robot, swung it and smashed it against the robot's head. The robot stumbled back, and so Izuku threw the leg away and then charged towards the robot. Izuku grabbed the robot in a headlock, and then, using the momentum of the robot falling down, he spun and managed to rip off its head. Izuku threw the head away, and then he felt like something was tugging on to his pant. Izuku looked down and saw as the robot he had ripped off the leg from one was holding on to him. The robot extended its arm towards Izuku. Izuku grabbed the robot's arm and twisted it and pierced the robot right through its head. Izuku looked up and stared at the last robot. Izumi quickly grabbed the robot's punch before it hit her face. Using her augmented strength, Izumi began to pressure the robot's hand until it was destroyed. Izumi kicked the robot back, significantly denting its chest. As Izumi was still holding on to its arm, it was pulled off from the robot. Izumi then grabbed the arm and threw it like a spear at the robot. The arm pierced the robot through its weak part in the chest, utterly destroying its inner parts. The robot fell to the ground, in between a sea of bolts and cables. Izumi looked up and saw the last of the robots. The last robot ran towards Izuku at an even more significant speed than before. Izuku still managed to dodge, as he was still not as fast as All for One. When Izuku ducked, the robot tried to knee Izuku in the face. Izuku managed to raise his metal arm, but the kick was so strong that the arm was dented and Izuku was thrown back. Izumi barely managed to dodge the punch coming from her robot. As the punch passed near her face, the robot opened its hand, and then it grabbed Izumi by the face. The robot threw her up in the air and punched her in the stomach, sending her flying back. Izumi landed on her feet, and she extended her hand and began to shoot several energy blasts at her. The robot dodged the incoming shots, running in between the openings, and when he reached the right distance, he tugged his arm back and ready to throw a punch at Izumi. Izuku was punched in the face, lifted off his feet, and was sent crashing into a wall. The robot ran towards Izuku and grabbed him from the hair. Izuku raised his arms to shield his face as the robot repeatedly punched him. At one point, as the robot retracted its arm, Izuku lowered his arm, and when the robot threw the punch, Izuku grabbed the robot arm, placing one hand in the forearm and the other one in the elbow. Izuku then began to pressure upwards with the hand on the elbow and downwards with the hand on the forearm. The robot's arm snapped in two. Izuku then grabbed the other robot's arm, snapping away from its grasp, and then held in an arm lock. Izuku then spun around and ripped off the robot's arm. Izuku threw the arm, then kicked the robot back, and then looked at the helpless robot standing in the middle of the room. When Izumi's robot threw the punch, Izumi met it with her own. Izumi placed all her strength behind it, and this caused a significant shockwave to be released. The robot was sent flying back, but now it only had one arm, as the other one had been disintegrated by the shockwave. Izumi stepped out of the smoke and stared at her robot. It was time to end this. Both Izumi and Izuku ran towards their respective robots. Izuku jumped high and then landed on top of the robot, bringing it down to the ground with him. Izuku then began to repeatedly punch the robot in the head as it started to crack. Izumi also jumped, and then in midair, she retracted her arm, readying the punch. Izuku also retracted his arm, and at the same time, they both brought it down on their robots. Their heads shattered upon impact. The battle was over. Both Izuku and Izumi stood up and looked down at the remains of their respective robots. They were now ready. This was the beginning of their new lives. The new life doesn't open up as a present, with pretty ribbons and assurance of comfort, yet more as a road of adventure with a degree of fog and chill. This is the road they will now walk in. It takes an adventurous heart to grab it, brave feet to travel it, and bold eyes to remain open to its curves and undulations. If it were any different, the masses would not stay in such unfulfilling lives from the cradle to the grave. To gain more is to accept that sensation of danger and risk as one reaches for far into the horizon, the same horizon they are looking at right now. Some say it's impossible, but for some, it's necessary, for when someone has burned down your house, and society believes you should keep on living in the ashes, as if there was still a roof, walls and doors, one must seek a new life, a new home, and that is precisely why they are now going to walk down this irreversible path. That's it guys. Thanks for watching and supporting us. See you in the next part.